you. Well, good evening, everyone. How is everybody doing tonight? Hey, it's so lovely to see you. I'm Rebecca Price with the Nashville Public Library's Special Collections Division. Hey! Which is right upstairs on the second floor and home to two of Nashville's beloved community spaces, the Civil Rights Room and the Votes for Women Room. If you haven't visited those spaces yet, I invite all of you to return and explore these places that tell stories and share experiences of Nashville's rich and diverse history. I want to welcome everyone to Nashville Public Library for tonight's program. We are thankful to all of you for joining us here tonight and for those watching live on YouTube. And we extend a special thank you to the Nashville Public Library Foundation and the Nissan Foundation for making tonight's program possible. Our Conversations in NPL series programs broaden the work Special Collections does upstairs in our program spaces, the Civil Rights Room and the Votes for Women Room, where we engage students of all ages, members of corporations, community-based organizations, and more in critical and reflective conversations on history, culture, and modern society. Each year, we focus on a particular theme to allow for a deeper dive into history and our understanding of who we are today. Tonight, we are excited to launch the first program in the 2025 season, Journalism. By its simplest definition, journalism is the act of reporting and publishing information. Journalism stands as a pillar of democracy, serving as a watchdog, a conduit for truth, and a voice for the voiceless. We begin the season tonight exploring the idea of journalistic objectivity with Lewis Raven Wallace. In May, we will screen the documentary Breaking the News, which asks the question, who's been omitted? The season will end with international correspondent Jane Ferguson discussing her journey as a war reporter in June. Just a couple of housekeeping issues. Please remember to validate your parking ticket if you parked in the library garage, which will validate up to 90 minutes. And the validation machine is located at the main circulation desk in the lobby. And again, please be mindful that we are recording tonight's program. Before we begin tonight's program, let us be reminded that we occupy the ancestral and traditional lands of the Cherokee, Shawnee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Creek nations. We would like to honor all the ancestors of this land on which we meet today, from the elders who have gone before to the generations to come. Tonight, we welcome everyone for a groundbreaking conversation on what we think is journalistic objectivity. When national reporter Lewis Raven Wallace was fired from public radio for publicly questioning journalistic objectivity, they began a journey into the history of journalism and its role in shaping information. The result was the award-winning book, The View from Somewhere, which takes a deep dive into the history of objectivity in journalism and how it's been used to gatekeep and silence marginalized writers as far back as Ida B. Wells. At its core, this is a book about fierce journalists who have pursued truth and transparency and sometimes been punished for it, not just by tyrannical governments, but by journalistic institutions themselves. Wallace weaves their own experiences as a midwestern transgender journalist with insightful steps through history, stressing that journalists have never been mere passive observers. And now, I'd like to turn the evening over to our host, Tasneem Grace, Vice President of Mosaic Changemakers, and a recovering former journalist.
That was good, Rebecca. Thank you. I am in recovery because acceptance is the first stage, so I'm right there. Good to see you all. Good to be with you, Lewis.
You too.
Thank you. We are here as part of an experiment. We want to invite you all into an experiment. We know we're also here to talk about the mythology of objectivity. I think we're clear. Raise your hands if you have one of the books already. Beautiful, great, because we're going to be referring to this awesome writing. The book is a history book. It is memoir. It is manifesto. It is critical. And I think it's celebratory, too. There's hope there. But what we want to do is acknowledge that sometimes in these conversations, we replicate the thing that we're also critical of, which in this case is sort of the status quo of having conversations where you listen to folks who are kind of experts, and you all just kind of watch. So we're going to change it up a little bit. We're going to engage, but we're wanting you all to think about your questions as renegade, rabble-rouser, revolutionary journalists. We want you to push us. We want you to ask us questions that really are beyond just saying, so why'd you write that? Because the truth is, Lewis does not have the answers. Page 219. Lewis says, I do not know. And I think those 3 words are powerful, especially coming from an industry or a calling or a science where we're expected to know. We're expected to assess, we're expected to discern, we're expected to spit out at you some kind of way of thinking about something. We do not know. And you probably don't know either. So together we won't know, but we can ask questions because that's really the basis of what journalism is. So we're going to do that. We're going to go through some definitions, and let's consider this kind of a media lab. So the word lab, not just laboratory, but collaboration. So this will be sort of a big old round table with several layers. Lewis, you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, we're just throwing it out there, y'all, because that's what good journalism is, trying new things. So Lewis, what's up? Lewis, if you could tell us, every journalist has a "this is when I knew I wanted to be a writer" moment. And I know for you it wasn't just writing, it was also activism. Can you tell us the story of when those 2 things for you converged, the writing and the activism?
Mm-hmm. So I came out as queer when I was 12. In the late 90s in Southeast Michigan. Shout out to my Michigan friends who are here. And at the time, there were basically no stories about people like me in a novel, in the news, anywhere that you would see on the day-to-day. And I had kind of an impulse and an instinct towards activism. You know, I didn't really want to be visible. I didn't want to be harassed or bullied, right? But I wanted people to treat me fairly, and I knew who I was. I had a strong internal sense of that. And so as I was coming out as queer, and then a few years later as trans, the main way that I connected to that was through storytelling. So I found these zines. Raise your hand if you know what a zine is. Okay, good.
We're with friends.
So it's, paper thing. That was one of the main ways that queer and trans youth were telling our stories and communicating with each other. And we were sending them in the mail. So you would write to somebody and say, can I get a copy of your zine? Or you would send one and they would send one back. And so I found these zines by other trans, and I learned the word genderqueer probably from a zines by other trans and genderqueer people. It was before we had the term non-binary. And I was like, cool, I'm gonna make one. Yeah. And started making zines with my friends about our stories and ideas about who we are and just exploring.
What did it feel like it sounds like you found family. What did that feel like finally?
I really did. I found an incredible chosen family who are still my family many decades later, and it was a powerful experience of collaboration. And later I would come to think of it as sort of my earliest journalism, right? Telling the news, telling like what's happening in my community that might be something that you care about. And because we didn't have access to or see ourselves reflected in any of these mainstream sources, we just made our own thing, and we're still doing that.
I love that. 2025, still doing it. Well, would you say that journalism is a calling, an art, or a science?
Okay, not a science.
Okay.
That one's easy. It can certainly be an art. A calling. I mean, I kind of experience it that way a little bit. I do think there are some of us who just feel kind of called to tell what we see. and that there always have been in different forms throughout history. Yeah. So I like that. I think I'm going to go with calling.
Okay, I have another one. Lifestyle.
Is it a lifestyle?
Is it a lifestyle?
Oh, boy.
And I asked that because part of what you're writing about is being on the fringes and the lifestyle of being the silent observer. Ask questions, but then you go back and write it up, and then you disappear again. Mm-hmm. And you're never really a part of it.
Right. So this is where we get into some of the tricky lines between how professional journalism has been conceived and taught, and what I think a journalist really is. I think a journalist can be any of you, right? It's anyone who, to me, commits an act of journalism. Like any kind of documentation, you take a picture, you put on Instagram, it's getting all spread around. Yeah. To me, you are now a journalist, right? Because you're doing that work. That's the work that the Black Lives Matter movement did to raise awareness about police killings that were happening that weren't being covered by mainstream media. That was journalism to me. But professionalized journalism trains people with the idea that that a journalist is an outside observer. And so it's a setup, right, for journalists to be people who don't identify with the communities that they're covering, for journalists to be people who are not necessarily accountable to the communities that they're covering. And that, I think, has been the source of a lot of distrust and mistrust in the media for marginalized communities for many years. I mean, I even remember as a trans youth, there was like some journalists who wanted to do a story about us, very much in that outside kind of model, right? Like, these kids are fascinating and weird, and it probably was very well intentioned, but our sense was like, why would we give them that? Why would we give them our sort of precious story when the way that we're depicted in the mainstream media is really dangerous to our communities? And so that idea of an outside observer, while in journalism schools it's taught as something that establishes and builds credibility, that has not been the case for marginalized communities, for misrepresented people, ever. We've depended on people from inside of our communities who are invested in our liberation and human rights to be those storytellers, like Ida B. Wells, who was very much reporting from within and for the Black community.
That's right. You all know Ida B? Okay. Memphis, stand up. Where you at, Memphis? Okay. That's right. Yes. And that's one of the things I love about your book is you give us the folks to explore and examine and whose lives are really fascinating. I have to say, you're talking about me, professionally trained to be a snoop. And I would say an inside outsider. Mm-hmm. So in some ways, you're trained to infiltrate spaces, be very nice and charming, cunning with the questions, and then you vanish. And hopefully you had a good experience, but I don't know that you really felt empathy. You might have felt I thought you were interesting, but I don't know that you felt I was connected. Mm-hmm. And I think that's my admiration for you, is that you found a way to still tell the stories without abandoning the process of gathering information. Mm-hmm. Here's where you all come in. We're going to invite you to be power sharers. I can't tell you what page Lewis writes about this on, but if you go into anywhere you find podcasts and look at A View from Somewhere and listen to his podcast, he talks about this other way of understanding the news, and that is sharing power instead of reporting on it or assuming that you have it and reporting on those who don't. So in this way, we're going to invite you to be in the room with the language of journalism. You're going to hear words that you're like, what does that mean? Because it sounds like shop talk. It's like objective sounds like shop talk. Bias is a little shop talky. Leads and things like that. So we're going to go over some words, some vocabulary for this conversation. And so we're sharing the power of language so that then we're able to sort of expand the questions we'll get to later. So Lewis, what is news?
Well, I think news is whatever's going on that you care about right now, right, in your community or in another community. What I think we receive as the news is whatever the editors and sometimes publishers think you care about or want you to care about. And so that's a manufactured kind of product that's a little bit different. And I was always struck when I worked in public radio. Honestly, public radio does a lot of great stuff. but everyone's favorite part is the weather and the traffic. That's news, and it's there's quite a bit of agreement that we care about that. We want to know. We're figuring out what to put on and how to get to work and stuff today, and I think that's really valid and legitimate as much as a deep and complicated story from across the world, and that the production of the news plays a role in kind of curating what we care about, right? The more you know about something, the more you can feel connected to it, and so on. So there's no neutrality in those determinations.
So help us visualize who's deciding what's newsworthy. Where does that take place?
I was so shocked when I started working in public media that about a year into it, so the first year I was in a big newsroom, and there were like people sitting around a table in the morning talking about what's going to be on the news that day and deciding. And often, this surprised me, often deciding on the angle before the reporting was done. So it's like, we need a story about this, and what's our angle? Our angle is this. And you would get an assignment, and you would go, and you would essentially try to get someone to say your angle. Which is, we should all be disturbed by that, right? But that was the process. But I think the perception was, because these people were all professional journalists, that they had this training that was quote unquote objective and had some kind of sense of what people want to hear. But that's so racialized, it's so geographic, it's so gendered. I had editors who would be like, there's flooding in the north suburbs, and so we got to do a flooding story today. There's flooding. This was in Chicago. There's flooding on the south side. Nobody was saying that in that same newsroom. So, and that's all news. Just depends on where you live.
That's right.
About a year in, I found myself in the position of coming in the morning at 5 o'clock in the morning as the sole host of the local broadcast of Morning Edition in a small town Ohio newsroom. And it was me alone deciding what was newsworthy.
A lot.
What? It's like, this seems bad, guys. Someone should tell everyone that it's just me.
As decided by Lewis Raven Wallace. So what is this thing, objectivity?
So I think there are sort of two pieces to it, and I agree, it's a boring word. And to me also a complex but also kind of tired concept. The two ideas that it encompasses in journalism are the practices of journalism, many of which are good, that are about fact-checking, verification, making sure that what we put out there is true to the best of our ability, right? We're just humans, we make mistakes. So there's objectivity as a set of practices. And then there's objectivity as a kind of attitude or performance. It's the performance of neutrality. It's the performance of, here's one side, here's the other side. It's the performance of seeming unbiased, quote unquote, for whatever the context is. And there's just no way around the kind of falsehood of that performance, because who the audience is, the time period we're living in, the geography, any number of factors affects what people perceive as biased or unbiased. And so the performance of objectivity is just that. It's an attitude, a style, a performance.
An act.
An act.
Wow. What about bias? What is that?
I like thinking about bias because I think it is very real. We all have internalized these biases, and they can be very complex. Some of the most kind of invisible forms of bias often come with being in the group that's more powerful or more normalized. So like whiteness in the newsroom I was describing. Whiteness was never talked about as a form of bias or a source of bias. But in many ways, it was the most common, frequent form of bias because most of the people making those news decisions were white. And because of being white, we're also used to having their viewpoint normalized and upheld. And so that's this kind of constant but very hard to see bias. Often the way that it's talked about in newsrooms is almost flipped on its head. Like, if you're a trans person, you're assumed to be more biased about trans issues, even though if you're trans, you've probably thought about things from a cisgender perspective and a trans perspective. You kind of know more than most people do and are able to think about it in more different ways, probably. Not necessarily, right? But so we all have bias on any issue. And I think the best we can do as news reporters is try to notice what those are, try to acknowledge them, and try to make space for those kind of challenging conversations about power dynamics, the power dynamics that may make it really hard to see.
I do notice in your writing that you push us to stand by some of our biases when they're representing kind of who we are, who we believe ourselves to be in that moment. I think that's a powerful thing to say. Own it. Let's stop pretending that you're just in the room neutral. I'd love us to, slide please, talk about the spheres of consensus. Oh, look, there they are. Help us understand how this, in some ways it's like the science of understanding where some of these biases come from. Take us through these, please, Lewis.
So this is an image that was developed by a journalism scholar named Daniel Hallen, actually in a book about coverage of the war in Vietnam. And that book is about the interaction between kind of social movements and activism and journalism and public opinion. And his idea was that the news is kind of constantly participating in and producing, helping to produce these three spheres. So in the middle, you have the sphere of consensus, and that's anything that in a sort of mainstream news source might be considered to just be a given. So I'm gonna give examples from a different time period because we're in a very confusing time period right now in terms of what's a given. So let's think about the 1950s, okay? Like mainstream media in the 1950s. The sphere of consensus is like apple pie is good, US power is good. Love this country. That's sphere of consensus. The sphere of controversy, the sphere of legitimate controversy is here are things that can be debated, that are legitimate to debate. So in the 1950s in the US, there was a debate happening about segregation and desegregation. That was considered a legitimate controversy and depicted as such. And then the sphere of deviance is anything that falls sort of so outside of that it's really not even going to be mentioned or talked about. A good example from the 50s would be gay people. Just, there were no gay people. If you're reading, the mainstream media, it wasn't a legitimate controversy. It just wasn't even there. And if it was mentioned, it was as sort of a form of deviance in itself, right? Like something so outside. We're not talking about gay rights. We're not talking about this at all. So importantly, journalists participate in the production of these spheres, right? So we have this immense kind of power in some sense to help things move from consensus to controversy or from deviance to controversy. So do obviously activists and politicians. So some examples that are more present of that would be when I was coming up, the idea that there were more than two genders, that it wasn't just male and female, and that's boy and girl. That was in the sphere of deviance. And then we moved it into the sphere of legitimate controversy, and we made it a thing. Like, there's more than two genders. We're going to talk about it. And now that's being talked about in the news. We have some really concerted efforts now to put it back in the sphere of deviance. Efforts to literally ban having that conversation or having that debate by the federal government. But obviously the way that news reporters and news platforms respond to that helps to move that conversation.
How difficult is it to move the conversations? I remember in one of your podcasts with your producer, Ramona Martinez, she says objectivity is the ideology of the status quo, which makes me feel like this thing that you're locked in. How easy is it, or what is the work that you have to do to get the spheres to converge, intersect, and then kind of disconnect?
So this is what's wild to me, and why I feel like so excited about the idea that anyone can be a journalist, is that I think, especially when we're part of and connected to social movements, we can actually create churn in all of this all the time, right? Like dragging something out of the sphere of deviance and into legitimate controversy, that's a few noisy protests and a few news articles, and you're there, you know? But that can go in the other direction, right? Like we have a president who's taken birthright citizenship out of the sphere of consensus, like if you're born here, you're a citizen, and into legitimate controversy, essentially by just talking about it. So that's a power that I want us all to exercise, essentially, and in particular, people with platforms. But a lot of people have platforms now, you know, not just journalists.
Speaking of platforms, you are critical, but you offer us some bright spots. And you tell us about, you're like, where, on what page, Tasneem? I saw your face. Can we talk about Sarah Alvarez and Bettina Chang and how inspiring it is that they are doing the work of shifting the spheres and still using the title of journalists, but in a way that it doesn't feel as though they're inside outsiders. They are inside their communities. That's a bright spot, that it is possible to imagine another way of doing things. I know you said you wrote this book looking for the rabble-rousers, the folks who are resisting traditional journalism. How did you find Sarah Alvarez? What do you want us to know about her?
So Sarah Alvarez had, like me, had worked in public media, and she similarly grew really frustrated with the conversations, the kind of insular conversations that were happening in those newsrooms, particularly the one that I kind of described earlier about the flood in the editor's backyard. There's another version of that where editors would say, well, why does Sally in Kansas care about this? And so there's this sort of idea of like, that we can divine what people care about, but when we're divining it, we're actually picturing this kind of normative, straight, cisgender, white woman. That's what's happening in public radio. Not all the time, but a lot of the time. And Sarah grew really frustrated with that. She was living in Detroit, and she was like, so much of the news here is not produced for the people who live here. Why don't we find out in a systematic way what people who live here want to know about? And she was specifically focused on low-income Detroiters. So she actually used data from 411 calls. What were people calling about, and what were they asking? And found that people were concerned. The number one kind of category of 411 calls was about housing and homes. And it was questions like, who's actually the owner of the property that I'm renting? Does it have back taxes attached to it if I'm thinking about buying it? Are there unpaid water bills, which is a whole scandal where unpaid water bills would be attached to people's contracts when they bought a home, and then they'd be, you know, underwater in terms of the bills for not having had access to that information. And so it was lots of just nuts and bolts, like economic information that people needed that actually was in the public record, but folks didn't necessarily have access to how to get that. And so she took that information, people want to know about housing and utilities, and created a text message-based service where you could text an address to Outlier Media, her company, and then Outlier would text you back with all the public records information about that property in one place. So it's financial news for low-income people delivered directly to your phone. A lot of people said, that's not even news, you're doing social services. And she was like, how is that not news? We hear about the stock market every day on public radio. That's financial news for people with investments in the stock market. That's not relevant to everyone else. So why don't we deliver this news that people need about their community directly to them? So she's so systematic, and I love that. I love that she was just like, we don't need to sit around and guess about what people want to know. We can find that out, and then we can make news that's actually a service to the low-income people in this community. And then sometimes the Outlier Media will notice a trend in the kinds of questions that are coming or in people that they're hearing from, and they'll do a story that they publish in partnership with another outlet that's more of that traditional investigative journalism style. That's like, here's what's happening. but really trying to address the fact that information that's published over here for this audience about directly affected people over here isn't necessarily helping directly affected people. It's based on a theory of change that doesn't always work in testing. You know, that the folks with more privilege who are reading the Detroit News and Free Press are gonna then like help the people with less privilege who are not. And that was not how it was actually playing out. So how can we give people news that empowers them to make their own financial decisions and not that tells some other people over here about what's happening to them?
And they're still doing this work today. Fascinating. Bettina Chang.
So Bettina Chang is one of 4 co-founders of City Bureau, which is a newsroom based on the south side of Chicago that similarly took, you know, a kind of locally driven approach to finding out what the news is and figuring out what should be reported. And theirs was about putting the tools of journalism into the hands of people in the community. So the foundation of City Bureau is a fellowship where they teach people who live on the South Side how to do journalism and storytelling, and they create stories about things that are happening in their community in a variety of formats. So they even do zines and they do radio pieces. Some of the work that they've done has been comics or flyers, things that are then distributed to, again, the people who really most need that information, who aren't being served by the kind of mainstream news outlets downtown.
Which is, you write about a whole nother way of looking at reporting. Instead of I'm reporting on a community or for them, I'm reporting from within them. What difference does that make to the readers?
I think it makes a huge difference almost immediately in terms of relevance. That oftentimes when you take sort of an outsider perspective, like if I come into a community that I'm not a part of, I might be like, wow, that's amazing, that's so crazy, this is happening, everyone needs to know. But everyone in that community already knows. So I'm almost inherently making news that's for someone else, right? And this happens all the time with the trans community because we're such a tiny minority that people will be like, wow, that's so fascinating, everyone needs to know. And it's like, yeah, that might be true, but all of us already knew that that was happening. So that's one thing, you know, relevance. I often, when I write stories or work on stories about trans issues, I try to really think about how to do that for a trans and a cis audience. So how can I do it in a way that doesn't handhold cis people so much that it's obvious that I'm not even talking to you if you're trans, but that also is accessible, you know, to a more general audience. Another really important aspect has to do with trust and accountability. So a lot of people from communities that have been maligned, underrepresented, misrepresented, just don't trust journalists. And I don't want to be like sort of a manipulative, like, well, I'm trans, so you can trust me, you know? Because that's not the way it is either, right? Like there's a lot of power differences between me and any other trans person. You know, I'm not a trans woman, I'm white. There are still many power issues that can come up, but sometimes there is an ability to like access a different kind of conversation, right, from within a community. And then the balance becomes how to do that in a way that isn't extractive of my own community too.
Right. I'm thinking too how you began this conversation saying that you could show up to yourself in order to write about your community and what that feels like just in your own body to spend your career doing that. That you don't have to be invisible to actually make a living or be a reporter. So I think that's awesome. Are you all ready for some power sharing? Okay, we see some head nods. I think we have some questions. Yes? I think you need a mic. Here we go. Yes.
Hey.
Hey.
I'd just love for you to build on what you just said. So yeah, how do you say, if we're trying to reach people who are on the inside and the outside of an issue, how do you strike that balance without sounding, say, tired in a way that is like, okay, if you're on the inside, then you get it already, but that helps people understand who say it's a deviant subject for them, and they don't. Yeah, I feel like that is difficult. Help.
Good question. You got that, Lewis?
Yeah, I mean, I think journalists often underestimate, and in some ways are kind of trained to underestimate, the audience's ability to hold complexity. So, you know, we're kind of trained to, you give one side and the other side, and anything more than that is going to be too much for people, you know, or you can't use words that they don't understand. As if everyone doesn't have Google and Wikipedia right now. So I think one of the ways, and I've read some really interesting research about this too, one of the ways that you can actually cut through preconceived, it's called binary bias, right? The idea that there are sort of two sides to an issue and either I'm on this one or I'm on that one, is to present issues as more complex. And if you give it, you know, 5 sides, 6 sides, lots of different voices, a kind of diversity of perspectives, that can actually cut through the binary bias for people. And we see this a lot in reporting about trans people, that a lot of it has been really horrendous, and it's really focused on, okay, here's this trans person, and you know, they're sad and they have had things happen to them. And then here's this person who is against them. And those are the two sides. So I try to do stories that are like, here's a trans person who something happened to, maybe they're sad or something bad has happened. Here's a trans person who's taken action around this same issue. Here's a group of trans people who are working together on it. Here are some people who think that's not the best way to do it and we should do it, you know, work in a different way. And that gives a whole different picture of what's possible, even just in how we might think about trans issues, right? It's not a, are you for, or are you against? Like, we're people who are trying to live in the world. And so I think it's a very important part of kind of the humanizing process, right? Not to feed into this binary bias of either you're for this thing or you're against this thing, and those are the two sides.
Lewis,
I hope that helps to answer your question.
Lewis, do you ever pull your own story into that reporting? So you're giving examples and then also telling what your experience has been?
I do in the book, but it's because people made me.
That was not the plan. I'm glad they made you.
To your earlier point about power sharing and also demonstrating the thing that you're talking about, or being the change you want to see and all this stuff, I was like, objectivity, it's a myth. Everything is subjective. Here's this book full of objective observations about other people.
Yes. Like, where are you?
That I read in a book, or that I got from an interview, and then people said, you have to tell your own story. That's what makes it credible. That's what makes it meaningful. And I was like, I do? Oh God, that sounds awful. Yeah. So I don't like to, but yes.
Mm-hmm. I think that's the power and the balance you're looking for too, that you're curious about. Because if I care about you or you give me something to care about, then I'm listening. If you just gave me facts in this book, I would not have all these Post-its. Like, by the time I ended, I was like, Lewis is my boy. And I wouldn't have said that, you're nice, but if it was just historical facts. I think it matters a lot to put yourself out there, be vulnerable. Oh, cool, we got some power sharers. Rebecca?
Hi, Lewis. Hi, Tasneem. Great to see you both. Thank you so much for having this conversation. I was actually talking with my dad earlier today about James Baldwin, and he was like, he grew up in a small town in South Carolina, and he was like, I grew up and I never heard about James Baldwin. Like, he wasn't in the news. I didn't hear about him in school because like you just don't know what you don't know. And I feel like there also wasn't access to like the internet and social media, and people weren't receiving news from all over the world at such a high, fast pace, like 24/7. And so I'm really curious if you have thoughts about how the internet and social media as for some people, like their primary news source has kind of like complicated this aspiration of journalistic objectivity, and what it's like when like the journalist sources aren't as, like it's not just big media anymore, but like it can be people like in their houses telling what's going on in their community.
I sincerely believe that that kind of access to information through the internet has been deeply threatening to power structures, and that part of what happened to me personally even, right, had to do with that. It was like, you're expected as a journalist to have sort of a public persona and be yourselfish-ish, but you can't be too yourself or you're considered biased, and that's such a tough ask in the internet age, right, where people can know a lot about me if they try to find out. But that for me was, you know, for trans communities, is like so much of how we come to find each other. It's how we put pressure on the mainstream media to tell our stories. It's how the Black Lives Matter movement applied that same pressure, right? It was like everyone's talking about this on Instagram now or on Twitter. And so the mainstream media ends up having to talk about it. And it put a lot of power into the hands of previously underrepresented communities in such a way that I think has been so threatening to the power structure that they're like, whoa, we got to get this Twitter under control. And in fact, we got to make laws that make it so that people can't talk about this stuff in school. And, can't, you know, it's scary, the kind of backlash that we're facing now. But I think the technology, to the extent that it's been accessible, has been a huge help for breaking open those conversations.
Thank you, Christian.
Hello.
Hello.
Hey. So as an independent journalist, you know, a lot of us are freelancing and we're independent. We're not working in newsrooms. Just practically, how do you, if you are an independent journalist, how do you convince an editor that your inside track is a positive thing and not necessarily a liability to the reporting? Like, how do you break into that break out of that kind of older school mentality and do that inside reporting?
I'm thinking. I mean, I feel like there's a lot in there, right, in your question about how those institutions operate and then also how individual editors operate. And for me, the biggest luck I've had with that has been just finding that editor who's sympathetic or who understands or who's trying to shift those conceptions from inside of an institution. Much, much harder dealing with an editor who really is just like, oh, if you're connected to this story, then your point is not credible, your point of view is not credible. But I think the most important way that that's happened has been through collective action. Like, we've seen a lot of collective conversations and activism to say, you know, drawing on the disability justice tradition of nothing about us without us, to say that, like, trans people, if we're going to be reported on, we should be reporters. And so I get gigs now where people like want a trans reporter, and that's because of the activism of my broader community making that shift happen in such a way that kind of surprised me. I was like, oh, they want me because I'm trans? That's kind of cool. It didn't used to be like that, you know? And now that's a thing. And the reason that it's a thing is because of activism. So I think that's, to me, the most important answer to your question is that it's not something that you do alone. It's something that you do as part of a social movement to change that conversation.
Yeah. Good question.
Hello, I'm from Clarksville, Montgomery County, Tennessee.
Hey, Clarksville.
It's a small, big town, okay? They think they're bigger than what they are. But I was recently blocked from Clarksville Now, and I know that's legal for them to do, but how do I counter? Because that's the main media we have. We don't have a news channel in Clarksville, Tennessee. I am a retired soldier, so how do I counter them blocking me from social media so I can't post? Now, the ironic thing is, 2 weeks ago, they posted an op-ed that I wrote about dismantling of DEI with our representative, which is Aaron Mayberry. So what do I do to counter them blocking me?
First of all, I'm really sorry to hear that's happening to you, and it sounds like on top of that happening to you, that there's some willingness to use and exploit your words for their own purposes as well. So that sucks. I feel like it's almost the same answer, right? Like around collective activism, like what I'm sure that you have allies and supporters and people in your community who can complain collectively, who can create your own site. We did one recently where we couldn't get I was working with a group of incarcerated journalists who couldn't get TEDx to accept our TEDx pitch. We wanted to do a TEDx of incarcerated journalists, and so we did an event called Censored by TEDx. So maybe you make your own page, censored by them.
That's good, right? Yeah. Good. That's good.
I want to hear what you think about this question of what.
I was going to say the same thing, like, feed them the same dog food. Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. And let us know. Maybe tell, we would love to hear back how it went. Yeah. You can tell Rebecca, she'll let us know.
Hi, my name's Ethan Schmidt. I'm a recent recent graduate from the MTSU School of Journalism in Murfreesboro. First off, thank you for your work. It was an excellent read. It had a lot of influence on the thesis that I wrote for my for the Honors College. And the thesis I wrote was kind of looking at how where independent political podcasts can be kind of an effective tool for engaging people on political matters. And one thing I was looking at was the need for a revitalized public media. And I know you had written, I think it was in chapter 5, about the Nixon administration's, and I think even the Reagan administration's crackdown on public media. What do you see as like the necessary goals for public media moving forward from like a policy perspective, but also from like just an internal like workplace reform perspective?
I love the foundational ideas that created public media that really were about, so broadcast airwaves are limited. It's a little different now with the internet, but actual broadcast airwaves are limited. There's only so many licenses, and the idea was it shouldn't all be corporate. Some of it should be responsible and accountable to the public in order to serve populations who aren't going to be as valuable to advertising dollars and so on. And so it was to balance the scales, not just in the sense of like political balance, but power balance. And some of the founding documents behind public broadcasting are so beautiful, kind of a visionary idea about what it could be. That, again, was really threatening to power structures in such a way that objectivity was used as a bludgeon constantly. Liberal media bias, that whole thing, that's not new. That was a phrase that was coined by conservative activists in the 60s and 70s who were like, oh, this is perfect. We can accuse them of liberal media bias, and then they have to shift to the right because it's public media and they're obligated to be fair and balanced. And the word objectivity is actually in some of the statutes that make public media possible. So it's been a really useful bludgeon against them in a way that puts them in a really difficult position, I think, now, because they are constantly under threat of federal defunding. With that said, I think that people power, people supporting public media. And it's funny because I got fired by them, but I'm always like, donate to your local public radio station, okay? Support them and then complain a lot. Like support them and then write and call, like pick up the phone and call. When I worked there, people would call and they'd be like, blah, 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 we didn't like your story about da-da-da. And then everyone's talking about it in the newsroom, like, oh, this person called and they didn't like our story. Like, it's a bunch of sensitive, nice people over there in your public radio station. Like, they're wondering what you think. So if you're like, this coverage is not about me, make your donation and then call and complain and really try to influence it, because it is an area where we can have immense influence, like more than you even know. I mean, I was talking to a reporter from the Washington Post last week, the Washington Post, who was like, yeah, every time I do a column, this one guy writes and he hates my columns, but he always writes and he has a whole criticism, blah, blah, and she's reading this one guy.
Yeah.
Complaining. She reads all of his criticisms.
Yes.
So, you know, you can influence people, like at the Washington Post, at your public radio, public broadcasting station. Tell them what you want them to cover. Tell them when you're unhappy with their coverage. I really think we need kind of an activist spirit towards our public media, especially because it does belong to us. That's the whole idea, and that's what makes it so potentially revolutionary. Right now, they're kind of operating like they're corporate. But if we all supported them and held them accountable, they wouldn't feel the need to operate that way.
That's right, that's right. And that's for you too, sis, from Clarksville. You heard that? Yep, that was good for you too. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I'm hoping you could give me some advice. So I grew up reading Walter Cronkite. So what do I do today? How do I assess objectivity? How do I obsess? Who should I listen to? How should I decide that? When do I know that I've gone off the rails? So help me as a consumer sort things out.
I'm just going to repeat the question very quickly because we didn't hear the beginning, but the gist is, I grew up reading Walter Cronkite. What do I do now? How do I go through this now?
And thank you for that question.
Yes, thank you very
I
much.
think Lewis loves this question. Lewis.
I mean, I actually feel like this is a beautiful I don't know, or I want to put it to everyone in this room.
Yeah.
Like, how do you make those decisions? You know, I know how I do it, but I'm kind of chronically dissatisfied, right? I'm always listening kind of critically, reading critically any news source, and I think a lot of people my age and younger kind of follow individual reporters, like as opposed to outlets. We figure out kind of the voices that we can trust and then follow them wherever they go on social media. And it's not necessarily about the outlet. Like, I'm a big fan of Masha Gessen's analysis and reporting, and I am not a big fan of the New York Times. But Masha Gessen now works at the New York Times, and so I'm reading that column because I trust them. But I would love, honestly, to hear from anyone in the audience who has sort of how you assess in this sort of slush of choices that we face. Yeah. Let's hear from
I also listen with skepticism to the news organizations. And so my way of balancing is to listen to opposing news organizations. So I listen to mainstream, traditional, and then I will switch over to more pundit type of news coverage. I just perceive that is more of a strategy for getting balance. And you know, when I saw this particular topic, it was like finding out Santa Claus isn't real. And that's coming from having worked in public relations for years. You know, I've always come from the perspective of, when I work with journalists, that if I can get a fair, balanced, both sides of the story, and leave it to the reader to make their decision based on the coverage. That's what I've always said that I strive for, that I hope for. But I guess in this time, that's where I find the most balance. The other thing is, I perceive news organizations are catering to their target audience. Like whoever their target audience is, that's how they determine what's news. That's how they determine what to cover. That's how they determine what ends up on the news that evening. So maybe I'm a little bit more critical than most because I've worked with reporters on the other side for so many years, but that's a strategy that I've been using for a while now.
I think that's a great one.
Well, I'm going to take a point of privilege right now. And I'm responding to that question, and then we're going to get to your question. Thank you for waiting so patiently. The part in your book when you talk about fair and balanced, and the example, I believe it was on the radio, discussing some financial policies. And in order to have it fair and balanced, there was the progressive political side, and then to balance it was the conservative side. But then the point being is, shouldn't it maybe be somebody with money and someone without money if we're going to get a real kind of balanced perspective and shifting what we conceive of as fair and balanced? So I'm going to let you ask your question. Thank you.
I'm going to add one thing to that, and I think anyone can do it. First, I want to congratulate you on being curious enough to wonder if there's another way to assess and discern. I think that's a first step. The other one is you don't need to depend on journalists and their supposed skills of assessments to tell you what's important. You can actually pay attention to the events that are happening using social media to figure out how to talk to the actual people who are living the experiences that you're reading about. And so then you're not like relying on Lewis to say, hey, this is something that you might want to consider important. You're talking to other human beings to tell you what their experience is. And I think by doing that, they're going to give you the opposing view. They're going to say, you know, my mama doesn't agree with me, but, right? You'll get that in there somewhere. But in that way, you're actually flexing the muscle of your own discernment, and you're trusting yourself to develop relationships with people who are living lives that are newsworthy, and not leaning on people from behind some wall or computer telling you what is, because that's what we're still doing. It's still going to be my view, or I gotta be honest, it's still gonna be Lewis's view. It's the myth of objectivity. So it's not the source unless you think the source is out there. You too are the source. So go out and find the folks and talk to them. Insert.
Do you think that it is or can be or even should be a journalist's job to try to move topics that matter to them that happen to be in the sphere of deviance, to move them, to work to move them at least into the sphere of controversy, or maybe even all the way into the sphere of agreement?
Absolutely. I think it is, and it should be, and it can. All of those things. Who is excellent at that, honestly, is the whole kind of institution of right-wing journalism. They have done that exact thing with, like, this whole stuff about trans women in sports is not a grassroots interest. It didn't come from people. It came from organizations and national well-funded organizations collaborating with journalists to say, this is going to be our new issue. This is going to be our new moral issue. We're going to push it. We're going to make it a controversy. And they literally did. And that trickled down. It did not come from parents and school boards and kids on teams and all this stuff. There's almost none of that, zero. There's so little evidence of that. But right-wing journalists in collaboration with right-wing organizers thought it through, thought this would be a really good strategy to create a new, after gay marriage passed, they ran some focus groups and thought, one thing we can really get people worked up about and excited about is bias against trans women. And we're going to use that and we're going to move it into legitimate controversy by just basically talking about it a bunch. And then any one little story about the one trans athlete or whatever becomes like the biggest thing ever. But that's been very strategic on their part and has very little in that case to do with kind of grassroots activism. So I think we can all take responsibility, right? As journalists, we can all take responsibility for which of those conversations we create platforms for.
One more question.
One more. Suit, glasses, yes.
I'm sorry they gave me the mic.
Okay, you then you. Okay. You're like, I don't have on a suit. That is okay.
It's okay, yeah. Okay. Thank you for coming and speaking with us today. Did your research and journey on where you've been through and getting fired and really looking into objectivity, do you think in today's media landscape there is a place for nuance? Do you think there's a place for something that is not screaming at the top of my lungs over here for my issue? Is there a place for, there's a way we can all benefit from this policy, and maybe only some of us can benefit from this one, but it's still a good thing that we support this. Do you think that we're going to ever get back to the more kind of the world is not a dumpster fire kind of news coverage? Thank you.
I mean, there's such a hunger, right? There's such a hunger in any of our communities, I would venture to say, for not just nuance, but also connection and trust, for a sense that we can empathize with one another and that we know how to be part of conversations about the greater good. I think that unfortunately, particularly TV news, but a lot of news journalism has found that their bottom line goes up. They do better when they present things as this sort of fiery, two-sided debate. So it's essentially entertainment, which I get. It's kind of fun to watch, right? It's like a boxing match kind of approach. But I think that all of us can be a part of trying to cultivate spaces where nuanced conversations are possible. I think in some ways the hardest place to do that is like on TV and for a national audience. But we can be doing that in our classrooms, in our libraries, in our public spaces, in our families. And then hopefully that trickles up as opposed to the other way around.
You feel hopeful? Okay. All right. Dumpster fire.
And then I reveal my dumpster fire tattoo.
Set up, Lewis, on the
I don't think it's going away, but.
I love that.
Well, we'll end on that note for this portion. Don't forget that Lewis will be outside signing books, so you still have an opportunity to speak to him and ask him anything.
I'm sorry, I really need to say something. I'm so sorry. It's not a question. I just need to take this opportunity. Please, I'm sorry to interrupt. I am trying to do something like this right now. And if anybody's looking to take a tangible direction in everything we've just talked about, I'm trying to start a newspaper right now with, sorry to out you, I know I'm being embarrassing, but with this guy and a few other people. It speaks to all these things that we've discussed. And we need writers and we need funding. And I'm not going to get a better opportunity than this. So I had to interrupt. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Please come see me if you see me and you're interested. Thank you. That's all.
Well, there we
Yay, make your thing. Make it.
Well, then there we now we have it. Are we practicing what we preach? So thank you very much. We'll be all here while we're signing books. So please take him up on that opportunity. So again? No? Okay. All right. All right, so Lewis and Tasneem, thank you so much for guiding us through tonight as we critically think about these things and reflect on them. And I'm thinking about the word bias, and does that necessarily mean a bad thing after hearing the two of you talk? And should we embrace our bias if it means I'm coming from my perspective and trying to make change for the better? So thank you so much for the food for thought tonight and your conversations and giving yourself so generously. Thank you all for your questions and giving yourself so generously. If I could have the next slide, please. Please, we would like to invite you back to our second program in this series, which will be May 8th. That QR code, you can register for it right now. We'll be back here having this conversation, taking it to the next level. This is a conversation about a group of people who said, all right, we will be biased and we will write an online newspaper with a specific focus in mind. And this is the documentary on that Startup the 19th, how they're trying to make that change, but then also their journey to start up and live up to their change internally that they want to have, because they will have their own internal struggles as they are trying to figure out whose voice are they representing and how are they going to represent that. So please come back on May 8th for that. And then whoever would like to, if there are any books left to purchase them, there'll be a line at the end of the hallway. The Parnassus books will be there if you would like to have yours personalized, your signature. But thank you all again for tonight, and we hope to see you May 8th. Good night.